Okay, last time, if you recall, at the end of our time together, I left us with something of a like a cliffhanger, which was if David didn't write the Psalms, where did they come from? And I mean, I'll tell you right now, the answer isn't going to be some other biblical character. It's not even going to be some other person or some 150 other persons. Um, who wrote any individual psalm is kind of like asking who wrote an individual proverb. But I think the question sort of misses the point. What we're after here, what I want to talk about today, is isn't who wrote the Psalms, but rather sort of where the category or idea of Psalms comes from. What is a psalm, and where did it have its home in ancient Israelite culture? Now, some of the answer to this we have already seen and talked about in our last session. Now, maybe it's because of the David stuff. Maybe it's because of how our religious practices work today. I think that we often read Psalms and we think of them as these very like individualistic sorts of things, right? They're in the first person. They're expressions of internal emotions and desires. So we situate them, I think, mentally in individualistic sorts of settings. You know, they're the kind of thing you say at home. They're personal prayers, that sort of thing. But we should remember where last time, where we saw the Psalms most prominently put to use in the Bible itself, in Chronicles, where David institutes the recitation of Psalms as part of the worship in the temple. So I hope everyone remembers this, right? That on that day, David appointed the singing of praises to the Lord, and then it jumps into one of the Psalms that we actually know, right? Psalm 105. Um, for all the detail that we have in like the book of Leviticus about sacrificial rituals, like that, what happens in the temple, in the sanctuary itself, there's literally nothing in Leviticus about what anyone says during those rituals. It's all action. It's no words at all. So much so that some people have suggested that for the priests who are writing Leviticus, right, the phrase that's often used is like a sanctuary of silence, right? Like there was no talking. And we might imagine a sort of silent ritual, but I think it would be pretty weird. Like not only do we have chronicles telling us that they were reciting psalms as part of the temple worship, we also, some 500 years later, have the Mishnah, which is the Jewish legal compilation from like the 2nd century CE. We have the Mishnah telling us that they recited psalms, particularly a collection of psalms that's known as the Hallel, which is Psalms 113, 118. The Mishnah tells us that they recited that on festival days, as indeed Jews still do to this day. Now, if we think about the recitation of psalms during sort of the ritual in the sanctuary, in the temple, yeah, okay, that makes sense for psalms that say things like, "Oh God, you're so great," right? But last time, if you remember, we were looking at psalms, right? Some of the ones that are attributed to David that weren't so much like, "Oh God, you're great." They were more like what we call personal individual laments, right? So like, "Oh God, you might be so great, but I'm in a lot of trouble here." And the question we might have is, how does something like that translate to worship at the temple, at the central sanctuary? Uh, and that's a really good question. I'm glad that you asked. And I'm not going to answer it right away. I'm going to get to it. So please just bear with me. I'm talking as if you're the ones who asked the question. In fact, I just got ahead of myself. Fine. So let's think for a second. What's the difference between a psalm that says, "Oh God, you're so great," and a psalm that says, "Oh God, I'm in trouble here"? Now, I suggested in the email that went out earlier this week that you might glance at a few psalms before our session today, though I didn't tell you why. But I'm sure that if you sort of gave them a quick once over, you might have noticed that not all psalms are the same. what I tried to do in the Psalms that I had you read was give you like a tiny bit of exposure to some of the main categories of Psalms that scholars talk about. So let's talk about what we see here. So Psalm 1 is about what sort of behavior leads to a happy life, right? So it jumps right in. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked. And it compares the way of the righteous with the way of the wicked. And truly, both of these lines that I just showed could come straight out of the book of Proverbs. And for that reason, we describe Psalm 1 as a wisdom psalm, right? It's a psalm that seems to pick up on the language and traditions of what we think of as the wisdom books of the Bible, the Proverbs, the Ecclesiastes, the Job, etc. There are, in the entirety of Psalms, of the book of Psalms, there's like 8 wisdom psalms. So they're not very prominent, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Obviously, nobody would really want that. But here's some representative verses, the kind of thing that you see in wisdom psalms. Again, very much could come straight out of Proverbs. Better is the little that the righteous person has, the abundance of the many wicked. Such are the wicked always at ease. It's well with those who deal generously. This truly could all be Proverbs, but in fact, it's all from Psalms. And these are why these are called wisdom Psalms. They just look like Proverbs. I'm sure you can see there like all these common threads. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. I'm done with them already. And I'm going to deal now relatively quickly with another category that's even smaller, which is the historical psalm. The one I had you look at was Psalm 78, which is probably the longest psalm I had you look at. The other choice you had was Psalm 105, which is basically the other example of a historical psalm. Oh, what to say about this? These historical psalms are just retellings of Israel's history. Not exactly in the same order as we have elsewhere, because it's poetry, right? The one thing we know about poetry is it's a little more free than prose. But basically, that's what they're up to. They're retelling our biblical narratives or Israel's historical traditions in poetic form. Again, there's only a couple of them, and so I don't want to like make a big deal out of it. But I will pause here for just a second, because Psalm 78, which you read, is one of my favorites. Not because I think it's particularly beautiful or particularly meaningful in any sense. Psalm 78 is my favorite because if you've been following me or hung out with me for a while, you know that my whole thing has to do with the Pentateuch and the different sources of the Pentateuch, the J, the E, the P, and the D. And Psalm 105, the other historical psalm, clearly is retelling the Pentateuchal story that we have now, right? Like the canonical combined from all the sources story. But Psalm 78 that you read basically tells only one of the sources stories. It only tells the J story. And that makes it this extraordinary inside the Bible witness to the existence and independence of our Pentateuchal sources. And that makes it a favorite of mine just for that reason. Okay, that was my brief aside about that. Psalm 8 is a fine example of what we call, not very creatively, a hymn. It's the litany of praise for the deity. And there's a lot of hymns in this Psalter, including like all of the Psalms at the end that start Hallelujah. Those all are categorized as hymns. There's in a book of 150 Psalms, over 20 of them are hymns. They tend to lean towards creation language, as you see here, right? When I look at the heavens, the moon, the stars, right? What you have created, that acknowledgement of God's creative power is very classic hymnic language. Here is the beginning of one of these Hallelujah Psalms. So when it says praise the Lord in Hebrew is hallelujah. And when it says praise him over and over again, that's the Hebrew word hallelujah. So hallelujah, praise Yahweh. Hallelujah, praise him. So this invocation of praise him, all the angels, all the hosts, sun and moon, stars, heavens, waters. Again, classic hymn, right? It's the litany of praise. These are all, so creation, praise, nature, it's all part of the same sort of basic hymn idea. Now, I want to get to the category that we've encountered already, which is psalms of individual lament. These are pretty easy to pick out. They're in the first person singular. And that's the individual part of this. And of course they are complaining. That's the lament part. So we looked at Psalm 3 last time, and here it is again. Psalm 3 says, right, "O Lord, how many are my foes? They're rising against me." Again, we've looked at this already. You're a shield, right? I'm tens of thousands of people have set themselves around against me all around. Strike my enemies, etc. Lots of foes, lots of enemies, tens of thousands of enemies. And here again, there's Psalm 3. Here's the other one that we've already looked at, which is Psalm 54. Save me, right? We've got the insolent, the ruthless, all the enemies. Who are all of these enemies? I have no idea. We have no idea who they are. They are definitely against the speaker of the psalm. And that's the sort of standard individual lament kind of construction. With the individual lament, and you can tell because I called it individual lament, means that there must be a different kind of lament. And indeed, we have a variation, which is the psalm of communal lament. The same idea, but in the first person plural rather than the singular. And Psalm 44 is a good example of this. Again, if this were in the singular, you'd be like, individual psalm of lament. I lie prostrate. My body clings to the ground. But it's in the plural. We lie prostrate. Our body clings to the ground. Help us. Redeem us. The thing about the communal lament is what we think of as very abstract in the individual laments. Oh, my enemies are all around me. I'm in such trouble. In the communal lament, they feel somewhat less abstract, right? In a sense, because what would the community as a whole actually be upset about? Military defeat, certainly, which is what it looks like Psalm 44 happens to be about. Famine, drought, crop failure. There's only a handful of communal laments in the book of Psalms. But of course, there is an entire book of communal laments that is really like the heightened form of the communal lament, which of course is the book that we creatively call Lamentations. Now, on the flip side of the Psalms of Lament are what we call the Psalms of Thanksgiving. Psalm 30, which I had you look at, is a psalm of thanksgiving. As you can tell right from the beginning, I've just given you the first verses here. I extol you, O Lord, you have lifted me up. You have not let my enemies rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from Sheol, preserved me from going down into the pit. It's almost, but you can really read this as like almost the continuation of the story that was started in the Psalm of Individual Lament. It's even really much of the same imagery, just with a positive fulfillment. Instead of what we're used to seeing, which is my enemies are rejoicing over me, it's, you didn't let my enemies rejoice over me. Instead of, I cry out to you, please heal me, it's, I cried out to you and you did heal me. Instead of, oh Lord, I'm in the pit, I'm in the depths of Sheol, it's, I was, but you brought me up. By the way, this psalm is this is so great because like you can really see here just how abstract and almost all over the place the laments are, and also therefore the psalms of thanksgiving are. Like this is the first three verses, and the person who's speaking is talking about enemies and sickness and death, like all in the first three verses of the psalm. And you're sort of like, what happened to this guy? Like this was a really bad day. That he's giving thanks for, clearly. Okay, that's Psalms of Thanksgiving. We'll come back to them in a little bit. There's about 10 of the Psalms that fall into the category that we call royal Psalms. And the one I had you look at was Psalm 21. So, you have proffered him blessings. You've set upon his head a crown of fine gold. You granted him life. Great is his glory. You've endowed him with splendor. You've made him blessed forever. These are royal Psalms. It's like I will admit that today, I sometimes it feels like it's a little weird to think about psalms that are like for the benefit of the king. Um, but maybe it's weird for us because we don't have a monarchy, at least not the way that they did. Ancient Israelites might not have thought that their kings were deities, like in the Egyptian sense, but they certainly understood their kings to have a special relationship with God. And sometimes that comes out, we see in the Bible language of sort of adoption, right? God has adopted David, for example, as his son, um, or even straight divine parentage language. Um, but the royal psalms aren't always about just praising the king. Sometimes they're prayers for the king, as we have in, for example, Psalm 72. Um, O God, endow the king with your judgments, the king's son with your righteousness, that he might judge your people rightly. Um, again, well-being for the people, reward of justice, champion the lowly, deliver the needy. Um, uh, right, this really concern about justice and righteousness. I should say Psalm 72, which is the one I've got up right now. Uh, this is the psalm that starts with a wish for the king to judge rightly, and a psalm that prays for seemingly both the king and the king's son. This is that one psalm in the entire book that is said to be of Solomon. And I think you can see, even in the clip I've given you here, you can see why that would make sense. Um, as ever, I suspect that that's a superscription that was added later by someone who looked at this royal psalm and said, justice, righteousness, wisdom, king's son. Boy, that sure sounds like Solomon, and tacked the superscription on. Okay. Lastly, there's a category that I will admit I sort of love. We'll talk about it more, I think, in a couple of weeks. The category called Enthronement Psalms. And the one I had you look at was Psalm 93. Here it is in its entirety. It's a short one. The Lord is king. He is robed in grandeur, which, those of you, it's my second week in a row talking about Handel oratorios. But the Lord reigneth. He is clothed in majesty. That's this. Uh, he is girded with strength. Your throne stands firm. You are enduring. This enthronement psalms celebrate the reign of Yahweh and tend to be really explicit about Yahweh as king, about Yahweh's throne, about Yahweh sitting enthroned over nature, about other deities recognizing and celebrating Yahweh's kingship. In a sense, they're sort of like a subcategory of hymns, but they are distinct enough to warrant a separate mention. And that's it. So those are like these that I've just put up are sort of our basic categories of songs. And what we're talking about here overall is genre. Um, and genre, of course, both tells us what sort of the main function of a text is, right? This text expresses lament or is a psalm of thanksgiving. So it gives us function, but also suggests that there are some common literary features that we can point to as markers of the genre. Right? So, the famous contemporary example is if you see a text that starts, "Dear someone," it's a letter. I've tried to point to a few such markers as we've been going along. And of course, there's like many, many more, and I can't go into all the detail here. Phrases and imagery that are commonly tied to one genre or another, right? Like, I am in the pit. It's an individual lament. I'm out of the pit. That's a song of thanksgiving. We looked at some of the wisdom stuff. Happy is the man who, that's wisdom, etc. Nature language in hymns. But in talking about genre, we want to be clear about what we can actually learn when we identify the genre of a song. Right? Identifying the genre of a song tells us absolutely nothing about the specific composition of any given song. Right? You can't say, that psalm is an individual lament, and then somehow translate that into knowing when or why or by whom it was written. That's not the kind of work that genre does for us. What the categorizations can tell us is something about the types of songs. In the same way that identifying a piece in the newspaper as a news story versus an op-ed allows us to say something about the kind of writing it is, what it's intending to do, but nothing about who wrote it or when. Knowing the difference between a eulogy and an elegy allows us to say something about these kinds of speeches in general. That is to say, when we're talking about genres, these categories, we're not saying something specific about this psalm. We are, of course, saying something generic. And we can ask questions like, in what context might psalms of thanksgiving have been recited? And so for all of the different categories. And there's not necessarily or obviously one single answer for every category. But the question is a good one that can be asked of all of them. When might people have recited something like this? Again, not when might someone have recited this very poem that I'm reading, but poems like this. Now, I've already suggested that we tend to think of the Psalms as having their home in ritual, in temple worship. And in some cases, I will admit, I think this feels almost obvious. We've already talked about hymns, which, of course, like we still recite hymns in communal worship today. That one's natural, I think, to us. Psalms of enthronement, absolutely, right? Especially when we remember that ancient Israelites understood Yahweh's throne to be the ark, right? The Ark of the Covenant, and for his dwelling place to be the very temple in which this worship was happening, right? So, of course, they're going to be doing enthronement psalms essentially in the place where that throne is. Royal psalms should be said at the royal sanctuary, which happens to be the temple in Jerusalem, which is situated right adjacent to the palace of the king. But what about the Psalms of Lament, which is the question that I asked earlier and said I'd get back to? The Psalms of Lament make sense as something that should happen in the temple ritual. So here's the fun part, the fun part for me. You have to remember that in ancient Israel, there was really virtually no way to access the deity, to ask for help, or to communicate anything else except through sacrifice. And this cuts against everything that we have all been taught, really, since of course we've all been living for 2,000 years in like a sacrifice-free era. But when there were sanctuaries in ancient Israel, when there was a temple, when animal sacrifice took place regularly, that's how you communicated, or at least that's how you opened the door for communication. And I'm going to show you that the Psalms are even sometimes pretty explicit about this. So let's go back to one of our favorite Psalms, Psalms 54, that we've looked at a few times. It begins with like the ask, right? Save me, O God, hear my prayer, right? Surely God is my helper, right? There's an expression of trust. And then near the end of the Psalm, and again, you're looking at the entirety of Psalm 54. Near the end of the Psalm, it says, with a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good, for he has delivered me from every trouble. What I'm suggesting, I think, is that when it says, with a free will offering, I will sacrifice to you, this is not metaphorical, nor I think is it like in some future time. I think that is literally what is happening as the speaker is speaking. I don't even think it's, I will sacrifice to you. I think it's with a free will offering, I sort of hereby sacrifice to you. In other words, Psalms can sometimes end up looking like scripts, like to tell us exactly how they're to be like performed in practical senses. I'll give you another example of a transition like this, again, from a psalm of individual lament. And you can tell it's a psalm of lament because it starts, my eyes are wasted by vexation, worn out because all my foes, right? There's our like, all of those enemies always. Away from me, all you evildoers, for the Lord heeds the sound of my weeping. The Lord heeds my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer. So like everything is bad, but then suddenly, and honestly, in a way that doesn't make very much sense, if we think of this as like a continuous speech without any intervening action of any sort, like suddenly the speaker is convinced out of nowhere, right? He's praying, and then he says, "Oh, God has heard my prayer. Why? Because right in that space between the two, I think that's right where he has actually offered his sacrifice and thereby guaranteed that his pleas are going to be heard. Now, if you go to the sanctuary to pray for help, once you get the help, where else are you going to go? So, in that sense, Psalms of Thanksgiving also have their logical place in ritual worship. And my favorite example of this isn't actually from any of the Psalms, but it's from the narrative, from the history, and specifically from the story of Hannah at the very beginning of the book of 1 Samuel. Now, the famous part of the story is Hannah praying silently for a son, right? And she's sitting there praying, and her lips are moving, but she's not making any noise. And Eli, the priest, thinks that she's drunk, right? That's sort of like the famous Hannah scene. But we should remember, when we think about that scene, we should remember what the setting is for that story. Where is she? Well, she's with her husband at their annual visit to the sanctuary at Shiloh, which happens to be in the history where the Ark of the Covenant is at this point. Now, Hannah could have prayed at any time, right? She could have asked God for a son anytime she wanted to, but she doesn't. She waits until she's at the sanctuary, until her sacrifices have been offered, because that's when she thinks God's going to be most receptive to her request. And sure enough, after Samuel is born, she returns to the sanctuary, right? When she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with 3 bulls, the flour and the wine, right? That's her offerings. And she brings him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And they slaughter the bull, there's the sacrifice, and they bring the boy to Eli, the priest. And after the sacrificing is done, again, after the sacrificing is done, then she offers her prayer. And we know what sort of prayer she should be offering, right? She's already gotten her son, right? She did the prayer of presumably lament, and she did the ask. So what should she be offering now? A prayer of thanksgiving. And that's exactly what we get. Hannah says in 1 Samuel 2, we get this wonderful prayer of thanksgiving. But as you read Hannah's famous prayer, you might wonder exactly what is she thinking? Because here's how her prayer starts. My heart exults in the Lord. I have triumphed through the Lord. I gloat over my enemies. I rejoice in your deliverance. This is totally the same language that we saw in the other Psalms of Thanksgiving that we looked at, right? Look, there's all the enemies that I have overcome. So as a Psalm of Thanksgiving, like generically, it's totally great. But for this particular situation, for Hannah's case, like enemies, deliverance, triumph, it's a little bit weird. You get to the end of her prayer, and it's even further afield from like what we think of Hannah's lived experience. The foes of the Lord shall be shattered. He will thunder against them in the heavens. He'll judge the ends of the earth. He'll give power to his king and triumph to his anointed one. Like God's enemies, thunder, king. Like what is she? Why is this a sensible thing for her to be saying? In the middle of her psalm, her prayer, we get something a bit more on topic. We get this like litany of the kinds of reversals that God can bring about. Right, the strong become the weak, and vice versa. The full become the hungry, and vice versa. The barren woman becomes fertile and pregnant, and sort of sadly, vice versa. And right there at that moment, right, while the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn, right there, and only right there, is the only even oblique reference to anything remotely connected with Hannah's position as a previously infertile woman who has miraculously had a child. It is a single line, not even a verse, a single line in this longer prayer. In other words, if in fact Hannah had gone to the temple and been lamenting because she was poor and she wishes she were rich, and then that had come true, and she'd come back and recite the exact same psalm, uh, it would be just as appropriate, right? One single line. So what's going on here? Yeah, I love Hannah's prayer. Uh, not, I mean, I don't care about the content particularly. I love the fact that it exists because I think that Hannah's prayer, again, not in the Psalms, but it tells us so much about how Psalms worked, right? So what do we see? First, prayer is always preceded by sacrifice, right? Which draws the deity's attention and butters him up a little bit for whatever you're about to say. Uh, so first, there's always sacrifice. Second, the words that the supplicant offers are, I think, patently not improvised on the spot, right? Like Hannah didn't come to the temple and say, I gotta say thanks to God for having just, been made fertile. But what I'll start with is, you messed up all of my enemies. Thank you. It doesn't really make sense. Instead, what I think we have here is we have pre-written texts that one selects from based on one's situation. Hannah needs a psalm of thanksgiving, right? Preferably one that speaks to what she's gone through. Well, okay, here's a psalm of thanksgiving. Yes, I understand it's got a lot of like enemies talk, but it does have the line about the barren thing. So terrific. And I'll when I say the psalms are liturgical, right? This is kind of what I mean. Not only that they were recited in the course of worship, but that they were already set, right? Like there's a set text of prayers from which one could choose, right? So for another example, when the king comes to the temple, when the king comes to offer a sacrifice, so all right, we'll pull out the royal psalms and let him choose one, right? You go to the temple because you're feeling oppressed and you want to ask for help. So which one of these laments maybe suits you best? You want to say thanks? You want to give God praise? Have we got some choices for you? And I guess in a sense, that's something of an answer to where the Psalms come from. Um, they're not only, I think, used in the sanctuary, but actually probably come from the sanctuary. Like in the same way that if you were to go into a house of worship today, like I'm really feeling a thing I'd like to, whatever, in Judaism, right? Like if you are like, I have somebody who's sick and I want to pray for them, there's a prayer for them, right? Like, and it's the same text, and like, your clergy can simply give it to you and say, this is the prayer that you should say in this situation. Same idea. Now, unsurprisingly, I'm going to complicate things a little bit because again, we're talking about genres here, and when we're talking about genres, we have to talk abstractly, and often abstractions don't quite match the reality of what's in front of us on the page. Right? Genres are not identical with texts. Like texts participate in genres, but you're never looking at the genre itself. Right? Genres are categories in which authors play. Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter, everyone knows, of course, except for the places where he didn't, right? Where he like adds a syllable or breaks the pattern, right? And so much of artistry, whether it's Shakespeare or the ancient Psalms, so much of artistry comes from exploring and expanding these generic borders. So we want to be cautious about forcing Psalms into specific categories, as if any psalm can be only one thing at a time. So here's an example. This is Psalm 24, which I may come back to in a couple of weeks. I'm not sure. Psalm 24 begins looking like a hymn, right? We're praising God. We're speaking of God's control over everything. We're talking about recalling creation, right? Which I told you already is like another typical feature of hymns. And then in verse 3, it gets a little, well, it's still like, I guess it's still a little hymnic, but it's different. Wait, we moved from talking about the whole world to now talking about Yahweh's sanctuary in particular. And we have a question, who may ascend? And now we get the answer, right? Like, those who are pure of body and mind may stand in Yahweh's temple. And again, a reminder that like, whether it's this psalm or ones like it, like or the genre, But this was probably being recited by people who were standing in Yahweh's temple, right? They're standing in the temple saying, who may enter the temple? People who are, clean of hand and pure of heart. That's us. These people will bear a blessing, right? And again, that's what they're there for. They're at the temple to sort of receive a blessing from God. Maybe this is therefore a psalm of thanksgiving. It has that kind of feel to it. And then, again, it was those who turn to him, speak mid, a little hymnic again. And then suddenly in verse 7, it all changes. O gates, lift up your heads. Up high, you everlasting doors, so that the King of glory may come in. So we've got everybody, now we're addressing the gates, telling them to open so that God can enter. You should get the sense, right? We're verging here very strongly onto enthronement language, right? You can almost see the procession. We're literally opening the doors to let God in to assume the throne. And then it repeats itself. O gates, lift up your heads so the King of glory can come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. So a definitive royal statement about Yahweh. How do you classify a psalm like this? I might in the end call it an enthronement psalm, but I think it's clear that this psalm is using language and themes and even structures from other genres in the service of the enthronement concept. And again, you can imagine this psalm being recited by the worshipers standing in the court of the temple, like on a festival day. I don't know, perhaps ritually recreating an enthronement ceremony for the deity, right? They're standing there, they're like, who gets to be here? We do. We are pure. And then they turn to the gates and they say, open gates. And they sort of are enacting this whole thing. They recite hymnic language. They proclaim their purity. They welcome the monarch in through the gates. It's a good example of often picturing psalms as performed can often be awfully helpful in overcoming what looks like, I think, generic confusion. In other words, as helpful as genre categories are, we have to remember that not every psalm fits into those categories. And that genres, even though they're useful for thinking especially about where the psalms come from, right? And that's what we're nominally talking about. The genres really do help us think about where do these things come from, right? So I'm telling you, I think they come out of the temple. But identifying the genre doesn't end our conversation about a psalm, obviously. And often, I think, looking for genre and trying to be like, well, what kind of psalm is this? As if that answers the question about what this psalm is. Those questions, that search can be distracting and misleading. And part of the problem is, so often with genre, we sort of tend to look for key words and phrases and themes, right? I said earlier, part of genre identification is what are the markers? Okay, well, it says happy is the man who, so it's wisdom, or it says this other thing, so it's another. So I'll show you why I think this is why this can be difficult. So you would see this. I will praise you, Yahweh, with all my heart. Tell your wonders. I will rejoice and exult in you, singing a hymn to your name. Okay, there's not much of a question there. This really looks like a hymn, of course. It's got all the hymnic language and all the key words and phrases and themes. Or you see this, right? When my enemies retreat, they stumble to your doom. You uphold my claim, right? That's Thanksgiving language, even with the enthroned language at the end there. Or you see this, right? Yahweh abides forever, has set up his throne for judgment. He judges the world with righteousness. This is obviously enthronement kind of stuff, right? So again, pointing to the key words and phrases. You would see this: have mercy on me, see my affliction. This is a psalm of individual lament by all accounts. Or that you see this, right? Yahweh has made himself known. He works judgment. The wicked man is snared by his own devices. Well, I'll be damned if that doesn't look just like a wisdom psalm. And you're going along and look, I'm doing great. And the problem is then you end up getting stuck because all of those verses are from Psalm 9. Right? They're all just from the same psalm. So what do you do? My point here, or at least whatever, one of my points today, is that genre identification, which is like a major form of analysis of Psalms, is not, in fact, the same thing as the interpretation of a particular psalm. But when we're reading, it is, of course, helpful to have a sense of what genre the thing I'm reading is. But we have to be as flexible in our interpretation as the authors of the Psalms were flexible in their use of their genres. Um, we want to keep in mind the sort of axiom that form follows content, right? Or the other way, content dictates form. Right? The biblical authors, including authors of the Psalms, chose the genres and forms and styles that most effectively expressed what it was they wanted to say. And if that meant sometimes mixing up genres, so be it. Right? Those kinds of rules exist to be broken. So that's my answer, such as this, to where the Psalms come from. That is to say, they are the poetry or the liturgy of the sanctuary. But I want to add an important caveat here at the end. Like, as I've said, when we're talking about genre, we're talking about types. If I say that the Psalms of individual lament come from individual worship at the sanctuary, I'm not saying that any given psalm of individual lament was written in or for the temple in Jerusalem or wherever. Even a psalm, if it's like Psalm 54, right, which we've looked at a few times, the psalm that says like, and now I offer a sacrifice, right? Even a psalm like that looks like it reflects actual practical use, with the reference to the sacrifice and everything, it doesn't mean that Psalm 54 is actually a literal piece of temple liturgy here, right? We have to remember that the Psalms, like everything else in the Bible, are first and foremost literature, right? They're all pieces of poetry that take up forms that may have come from the temple. But in the same way that we have like epistolary novels, right? Novels that use the form of the letter, but aren't actual letters that anyone ever sent. So too, our Psalms may be purely literary, right? They're taking up the genre of something that existed in a real life setting, and then they're writing a new one or creating a new one that exists purely on a literary level. Some of them, whatever. Psalm 119 is 176 lines long and it's an acrostic, and there's no way that anyone was actually like, for sure that one is literary to its core. It's very much a written thing. But even if we can't know for any specific psalm where it comes from, it is actually very helpful to understand why the Psalms look the way that they do. And that's where understanding genre comes in. So that's like big picture genre where stuff comes from. Next time, we're going to like drill down like really deep into the ins and outs of how biblical poetry works on a more granular level. And in advance of that, again for next time in the email, I'll give you a little bit of homework to do. But for now, I'm going to look and see what kind of questions we got going. Find the question. Where did my questions go? Hold on. I'm going to find my questions really quickly. Somehow I have deleted them. Let's try this. There we go. Okay, wonderful. Okay, let me get back to let me get some questions here. Okay. Do we know about some other contemporary Near Eastern cultures that have forms similar to Psalms or similar genres that we have some record of? And the answer is yes. Certainly, we know that we have poetic compositions. I'll give you an example I talked about Psalms of communal lament, which is Psalm 44, which you guys looked at. There are Psalms of communal lament from like the 3rd millennium BCE in Mesopotamia. Actually, there's stuff that looks a lot like Lamentations, like specifically Psalms of communal lament over the downfall of a city. So we've got that on the one hand. We for sure have like hymns and praises of deities all over the place. Um, in fact, there are some psalms in the Bible, and I'm almost positive I'm going to do this one with you guys in a couple of weeks because I love it so much. But Psalm 82, which is a relatively well-known psalm that sort of talks about, it's like God takes his stand in the council of the divine council. This is really cool psalm. It's like 8 lines long. Um, it is so similar to the kinds of poetry that we find from uh, I apologize if you haven't heard of, right? Like the Ugaritic civilization, the city of Ugarit on the sort of coast of northern coast of Syria, Lebanon. It's so similar to their kinds of poems that many scholars think that psalm. We'll probably look at another Psalm 29 also. Uh, Many people think that psalm was actually a Canaanite psalm that Israelites took over and simply replaced the name of a Canaanite deity with the name of their deity. So yeah, there's lots of stuff. I mean, not universally, but most of the forms of the Psalms are pretty well attested as existing all over the place. Um, okay, uh, here's I talked about Psalm 78 being like a psalm that seems to be following the J storyline, and so that inspired a couple of questions. If there is a psalm that's like the J psalm, can we take mentions of sacrifices as evidence of P psalms? That is the priestly source of the Pentateuch. It's a really fun question. The answer is no, at least not as we have it. And here's why. Um, Everybody sacrifices. Their sacrifice in every Pentateuchal source, in virtually every book of the Bible. Everybody in Israel was sacrificing. So sacrifice on its own doesn't mean we're looking at a priestly text. I should say, doesn't mean we're looking at a priestly text like from the priestly scribes responsible for the Pentateuchal material. If I'm going to tell you that the Psalms come out of a sort of cultic ritual setting as a whole, they're kind of all priestly texts. Um, but in order for me to see a psalm and be like, that's a psalm that clearly is like based on some like really like priestly, like Pentateuchal priestly stuff, I needed to refer not just to sacrifices, but to the specific kinds of sacrifices that are known only to the priestly authors. So if it said something like, if it says I offer a burnt offering or offer an offering of well-being, everybody knows about those. If it said, so I'm offering a guilt offering, I'd be like, oh, uh, whoever wrote this psalm knows something of the priestly Pentateuchal stuff like Leviticus, because it's the only other place in the Bible that really shows up. Okay, another question. Were psalms passed along in oral tradition until there was finally a final product? Um, I suspect that the answer is yes. Again, I want to distinguish between like psalms as an idea and the psalms that we have in the book of Psalms. So Psalms, like much of Israelite literature, probably did indeed have a oral background to it. But I'm again mostly to do with the fact that like the very small or low level of literacy. Right? Somebody goes to the sanctuary and they say, "I want to offer. I want to say thanks to God. How do? Hey priest, how do I do that? I brought my lamb to offer." So okay, they kill the lamb, they do the sacrifice, and then like if the priest were to be like here and hand the person a scroll with a psalm on it, there's a 99.9% chance that the person receiving the scroll isn't going to know what to do with it because they can't read. Um, so, at a certain point, I suspect that um, these were probably passed down orally among the priests, or perhaps kept in some sort of written archive, but again recited orally to the people who were in the sanctuary using them. That's Psalms as a whole, like as a concept, as a genre. I think that's probably true. The Psalms that we have in the Book of Psalms, again, like I'm a little insistent on us thinking about those as literary products. Those are written. I mean, all we have of them is written. And even where we can see things like what look like call and response, we may see more of that as we look at more psalms over the course of the next 3 weeks. Even when we see call and response, again, like I don't need to think, oh, that I'm looking at like a transcription of something that actually happened in the sanctuary in ancient in like Jerusalem. Um, I'm just looking at a literary piece that is taking up the form of what was once oral speech. Um, why did the canon not organize the Book of Psalms by genre? Uh, Honestly, it's more interesting this way. Uh, but again, I don't know. It was part of the answer has to do with like part of the answer probably has to do with the chronological development of the Book of Psalms. I said a few weeks ago, it really developed over time as something like a rolling corpus, and it's not as if they were like all talking Psalms at Thanksgiving and then they suddenly were like all royal Psalms in a chronological thing. So some of them do come in chunks, right? Like you have the chunks of Hallelujah Psalms near the end. So there's some canonical organization that is by genre, but for the most part, again, like we really don't know. Um, we don't know. But if we think of it as sort of like a rolling corpus where they're adding on in chunks, so those chunks probably included all the genres at one time. Okay. Uh, were psalms created or compiled at different sanctuaries? Is there any way to know? There is no way to know. What I would say is, again, purely speculatively. Um, it is only in the seventh century, late seventh century, probably somewhere only in the late seventh century at best, that like the idea of a single temple or sanctuary in ancient Israel would have existed. Before that, there were just local sanctuaries all over the place. And my assumption is these kinds of things were recited in all of them. Um, but there are no references like, oh God, here I am at Shiloh, or here I stand, God, in Jerusalem. But even when they say things like, oh God, I am here in your house, or in your holy, on your holy mountain, it's, it's tempting to say like, oh, that's the temple in Jerusalem, but it doesn't have to be. In the same way that like today, every church is a house of God. Um, I think they had the same kind of mindset then also. Um, uh, can generalities in the Psalms tell us anything about history or about exilic, or post-exilic history? Um, and the answer is almost very, very little. Again, the Psalms are so generic, right? They're so not specific about the kinds of uh, um, trials that people are going through, or kinds of experiences. Again, there are some. I've talked a lot. I keep on referring to Psalm 137, right, by the waters of Babylon. I think that one gives us a glimpse into the mindset of the Jews in exile in Babylon. But at the same time, I don't want to ever like I never want to say that any single text, a psalm or even a Pentateuchal source or even a book of the Bible is representative of anything more than the single text and sort of presumable author that lies behind it. Somebody saying there by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept as we thought of the O Zion. And we can say, oh, they must have really been missing Jerusalem. But we also know, in this case, for example, we know that when you know the Israelites were allowed to go back from Babylon back to Israel, most of them were like, "Nah, I'm good. I'll stay here." So we don't want to take even a psalm that's as sort of emotionally evocative as that and say, "Oh, well, that must have been what life was like there." So like I want to like we've got two generalities, right? Like you've got the abstracted generality of the content of the psalms itself, which tells us so little, and also the generality I want to avoid of assuming that any given piece of literature is representative of the entirety of Israel or Israelite ideas. Um, Someone's asked, is the name of God in the Psalms most often Yahweh? So here's what I'll tell you. The name of God is always Yahweh. I think what's being asked there, though, is like, is is when God is referred to in the Psalms, is it usually by the proper name Yahweh or by the more general sort of generic term Elohim, gods or God? Um, and I have not looked. My suspicion is that that Yahweh is used more often than not. But I think I mentioned a few times ago that there's a whole chunk of Psalms in the middle where it really looks like someone has gone through and replaced Yahweh with Elohim almost everywhere, like as if someone was like, I don't know, piously getting the name of like the proper name of God out, replacing it with like this sort of safer general term, which is like a fascinating phenomenon because it suggests, all kinds of things about how these things were edited and perhaps late editing of them. So there's, uh, uh, again, I don't have the numbers, but like I think the fact that you have a whole chunk where they've replaced Yahweh with Elohim probably speaks to the idea that Yahweh was pretty prevalent um, all over the place. Okay, it is 8:29, and I've reached the end of our time together. Uh, Next time, as I suggested, we're going to really talk about like how biblical poetry works, which is I love so deeply because um, it doesn't rhyme and it doesn't have meter. And you might be like, oh, okay, I know what that looks like. I read the New Yorker, right? I know what poems without rhyme or meter look like, but it's not that either. And it's like I think understanding like the actual mechanics of biblical poetry um, really opens up entire worlds to us. Oh, in order to really do that well, we all have to learn Hebrew. So do that, and I'll see you next week. Okay, thanks everybody.